Okay guys, let's quickly look at human gaseous exchange. Now, you are actively breathing in the air around you as I'm reading this sentence and as you are writing this sentence. Now, your life depends on this inhaled air. Okay, so let's quickly look at the structure of the human respiratory system. Now, as you can see, when you look here at the top, you'll see that there's a nasal cavity, which is just behind the nostril. You have an oral cavity, a pharynx, and a larynx, then the trachea, and then you have your left bronchus and the right bronchus. Okay, you also have then a left lung and a right lung. Okay, this is actually the right lung and not the left lung. Then you have a pleura there, which is the membrane that protects the lungs. And then you have your ribs, which also serves as protection, and the diaphragm that helps with breathing. Okay, so the air passage and nasal passages, the pharynx, the epiglottis, the trachea, the bronchiole, the lungs, and the alveoli all make up the human respiratory system. Okay, so now we're going to look at the trachea or the windpipe. Now, this picture is quite a little bit graphic. It's not a person's, so you can relax. Now, the trachea is located in front of the esophagus. It's a long tubular structure with C-shaped cartilage rings to keep it open. Then the trachea is lined with ciliated columnar epithelium that has little goblet cells that is there to secrete mucus. Now the cilia beats upwards, flicking out any dust and dirt and all foreign particles, while the mucus moistens the air and traps the germs and dust that might enter the trachea. Okay, so on the left you'll see there's a picture of the larynx and the trachea. Now, the larynx is the start. Then the trachea follows and it branches into two bronchus, a left one and a right one. Now, at the end of each bronchus is bronchi and then bronchioles and alveoli later on. So, let's look at the larynx and epiglottis. Now, the larynx is also known as the voice box, and it contains voice cords, the thing that you use to make so much noise. Now, the epiglottis is a tiny little flap-like structure that is made of cartilage, and it opens and closes the opening of the larynx when food is swallowed. So, it forces the food into the esophagus and not into the trachea, because if it goes into the trachea, you're going to choke. Okay, let's look at bronchi and bronchioles. Now, the bronchi and bronchioles are ciliated tubes that move air from the trachea to the alveoli into the lungs. Now, the trachea divides into a left and a right bronchus that enters the left and the right lung respectively, as I have said. Now, both are lined with mucous membranes and are held open by O-shaped cartilage rings. Now, each bronchi end in an infundibulum, which consists of groups of alveoli. Now, bronchioles do not have cartilage rings. The walls are made of smooth muscle that can contract and relax to alter airflow. Okay, so there's a pretty little picture just to show you what a lung looks like and then what the alveoli look like at the end of the day. Now let's look at the lungs. Now, the lungs are two spongy structures that's located in your chest. Now, they are surrounded and protected by 12 pairs of ribs. Now, the intercostal muscles are around and between the ribs. Now, each lung is surrounded by a double membrane, which is called the pleura, and it rests at the bottom of a dome-shaped muscle, which is called the diaphragm. Okay, let's look at the alveolus. Now, the alveoli are small little air sacs that allow gases to dissolve in and diffuse through their thin, moist lining of squamous epithelium into many tiny little blood capillaries that attach to them. Now, there's many alveoli per lung, which means that there's an increased surface area for efficient gaseous exchange. The gases then move in and out of the bloodstream through the capillaries on the alveolus. Okay, now I'm not going to go through all the adaptations of the lungs and their functions, but you can go through them. It's important that you know the different adaptations and their functions. Okay, so let's quickly look at the ventilation of the lungs. Now, there's a mechanism of breathing that you need to know. Now, to maintain a good and healthy supply of oxygen, fresh air must constantly be brought into the lungs from the environment. Now, that's why I bug you in class to always open the windows for fresh air. It is just to make sure that you constantly get a good, healthy supply of oxygen. Now, by now, I hope you have realized that breathing takes place in two stages: inhalation and exhalation. So now we're going to look at what happens with inhalation and exhalation. Okay, so when you inhale, your chest expands, the ribs expand, the diaphragm contracts, okay, meaning it moves downwards. When you then exhale, your chest contracts and the diaphragm relaxes, meaning it goes back to its dome-shaped position where it lays under your lungs. Now, with breathing out, with all these contractions, it forces the air out of your lungs. For inhalation, the reason everything expands is to make sure that there's enough space for you to inhale. Okay, so let's quickly look at the differences between inhalation and exhalation. Now, for inhalation, the muscles of the diaphragm contract and it flattens. Now, the intercostal muscles, they also contract, which raises the rib cage upwards and outwards. The thoracic cavity enlarges from side to side and from front to back, which will then increase the total volume of the chest. Now the lungs expand, and since the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere is higher than that in the lungs, the air flows into the lungs. Now for exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes and returns to its original dome shape. Now the intercostal muscles, they then also relax and the rib cage moves inwards. The volume of the thoracic cavity will then decrease. And since the carbon dioxide concentration is higher inside the lungs than in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide flows out of the lungs. Okay, so now boys and girls, as you can see, what happens in inhalation, the exact opposite happens in exhalation. So you can basically just study inhalation or exhalation because the one is the exact opposite of the other. It will make your learning a lot less and more compact. Okay, now let's look at gaseous exchange. Now, gaseous exchange is a process that takes place in the alveoli as well as in the tissues. Okay, now again, I'm not going to go through all the adaptations, but it is important that you go through them. Now, the alveolus is lobed. Now, it has these tiny little lobies that makes it look like broccoli. Now, that increases the surface for gaseous exchange. It's lined by a single layer of squamous epithelium. Now, the reason to that is to provide a thin surface for gaseous exchange. Okay, so let's look at homeostatic control of breathing. Now, it is important to control breathing because the cells need a constant supply of oxygen for cellular respiration and the removal of carbon dioxide they produce. Now, this is known as the homeostatic control of breathing. And homeostasis is the maintenance of a constant internal environment. Now, when we did homeostasis previously, I told you that homeostasis is basically the maintenance of a constant internal environment. And you need to remember that when we talk about homeostasis, you need to automatically think it is maintaining a constant internal environment. Now, the brain, more specifically the medulla oblongata, houses the respiratory center. It's responsible for the control of the rate of breathing and with that, the rate of the heartbeat. So, a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood will stimulate the sensory cells to send impulses to the respiratory and cardiovascular centers in the medulla oblongata, that is in the brain. Now, here the impulses are sent to the diaphragm and intercostal muscles to speed up contraction and relaxation. Now, the rate of breathing thus increases and more carbon dioxide-rich air is exhaled. The cardiovascular center then sends impulses to heart muscles and arterioles. Now, as soon as the heart rate increases, the arterioles constrict and blood is flowing a lot faster. So the carbon dioxide reaches the lungs faster so that it can be exhaled a lot faster. So thus the carbon dioxide concentration in the blood returns